Have you ever had a game that you consider it to be like your game? You know, like something that features so many things you love that's all packaged in one video game where it almost feels like it was made especially for you. I'm sure you can think of one, right? Well, for me, that would have to be the 2010 Nintendo Wii game, Disney Epic Mickey. I know it ain't perfect, but I love that game. Like, played it multiple times to get 100% loved it. In fact, I love that game so much that I even made a whole web series based on it. Anyone remember the Epic Mickey files? Anybody? Well, for me, it was something that combined many of my loves and passions into one entity. It was all about Disney history. It featured lost media. It stars Mickey Mouse. It's a Nintendo Wii game. And the aesthetic is a dark, twisted steampunk version of Disneyland. If I didn't know better, that sounded like a fan fiction that was just too good to be true. And yet, it is true. And it's one of my personal favorite games because of it. Now, as I am recording this, it is the 10th anniversary of the game's release. And I just need to go and ask you something. You didn't think I wouldn't do anything to mark the occasion, did ya? In the past, I've talked a lot about Epic Mickey in several different ways. I've done reviews of the game, I've talked about the many lost residents of the wasteland, I made a whole painting dedicated to the first game, but I have yet to discuss about the one thing that isn't as well known, but still as fascinating as Mickey's adventures in the forgotten world of Disney. The franchise's history. This is the story of how a long-forgotten cartoon character made by Walt Disney sparked the idea of showing a new side of Mickey Mouse that no one had ever seen before. One that rejects the unappealing image of the kid-friendly corporate mascot in order to become more adventurous, be taken more seriously, and not be afraid to admit that he can be flawed, all while facing some of the darkest and most twisted depictions of Disney iconography. It was so close to becoming Mickey's greatest moment in gaming, but sadly, his time to shine in the industry did not last long, and the franchise itself was ultimately lost in the wasteland. So how did Disney make Mickey Mouse momentarily epic? Well, let's find out. Our story begins all the way back in 2004 when a small think tank group at Disney's video game company, Buena Vista Games, later called Disney Interactives, were asked to think of an idea of a new game that everyone would want to play that starred Mickey Mouse. It seemed like a challenge, especially when the mouse's popularity wasn't so great at the time, but the team found some inspiration not from Mickey Mouse, but what came before Mickey Mouse. The idea that they have developed turned out to be so amazing that they ended up making a whole pitch not just in front of the heads of Disney's gaming division, but in front of the heads of the whole company, including then President and Chief Operating Officer Bob Iger. The main hook of the game wouldn't necessarily be Mickey Mouse, even if he's the main character that the player controls. Rather, it was Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. He would be the main villain of the game, who spent around 80 years in the shadows watching who was basically a round-eared clone of himself become one of the most well-known cartoon characters of all time, a title he thought belonged to him. This was an idea that the executives adored and were more than eager to greenlight the game. But there was just one problem. Disney did not own Oswald. In fact, they never had the rights to the rabbit in the first place. You see, when Walt and his crew were working on the Oswald cartoons back in 1927, they were under the contract of Universal Pictures, which producer Charles Mintz infamously used to screw Walt over a year after and resulted Disney to quit those cartoons and later created Mickey. Following afterwards, Oswald still kept on going throughout the 1930s with his own series of cartoons, mostly led by Walter Lantz, until Universal had their own brand of popular cartoon characters like Woody Woodpecker, and the rabbit was since treated like a side character in case they needed a cartoon bunny for a scene. It wouldn't be until several decades later when Oswald received attention again, this time to bring him back home. In early 2006, Bob Iger, who became Disney's newest CEO after Michael Eisner, made a deal with NBC Universal to give the company sportscaster Al Michaels in exchange for some small assets, including the rights to Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, to which they agreed to. As for Michaels, he was definitely cool with the fact that he got traded for a rabbit. He wanted to go back working with his old buddy John Madden, and he even got his wish much later where he became a Jeopardy answer. According to sources, Iger didn't just bring back Oswald for the sake of preserving the character's legacy as a Disney creation, but he also wanted to make sure that the company had all the materials needed in order to execute that great video game pitch he remembered before he became in charge. And so, now that Oswald and Mickey are together in the same place, it was time to make an epic game. While it took a while to find the right people to make it, it wasn't until 2007 when Disney acquired the freshly built Austin-based game developing studio Junction Point, founded by Art Min and Warren Spector, whom the latter is well known in the gaming industry as the guy behind the Ultimate games, System Shock, and Deus Ex. They were prepared to develop a Half-Life game for Valve, but once Disney grabbed their hands on the studio, it didn't look like they had time to work with Gordon Freeman anymore. At that point, Spector had a meeting with the company to propose new gaming ideas, none of which Disney cared for. They were just waiting for him to finish so that they could pitch him their plan for a game featuring both Mickey Mouse and Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Now, at first glance, Warren seems like a weird choice to lead a Mickey Mouse game, since the projects he's known for are not the kind that would have the Disney style, if you get what I mean. However, what very few knew at the time was that Warren is a major animation fan. In fact, his master's thesis was on the history of the old Warner Brothers cartoons, and one of the first games he developed was a pen and paper RPG called Toon. So when he was given the opportunity to make a big video game starring Mickey and Oswald, he knew this was the perfect game for him to make. As it is a Disney project that dives into the company's history, this gave the Junction Point team full access to Disney's archives to research anything and everything they wanted to check out. And they had access to all the archives, not just the main one with the Walt Disney Archives, but also the Animation Research Library, the Imagineering Research Center, the Prop Archives, and many more to indulge as much of Disney's heritage in order to create their forgotten world of Disney, where almost every detail included in the game is based on something the company made before. Not to mention that, as it does lean more into Disney's animation legacy, the crew had to watch hundreds of cartoons and sometimes recreate them in CG in order to get a full understanding of the movements of their characters. They also brought on board animation veterans from both Disney Animation and Pixar to help them out and give notes so that they could perfectly capture the classic Disney style.
Each one of us took a scene and reproduced it in 3D from what we saw in 2D, trying to figure out what was the appeal that drew us to Mickey in the first place.
So with all the research material that they could ever wish for, and experimenting with the endless possibilities they could do with combining so many different elements together as if they were freaking Dr. Frankenstein, the studio took Disney's idea and expanded to one of Mickey's biggest and most adventurous stories. Inspired by the Sorcerer's Apprentice segment in Fantasia, it was about Mickey who played around when he shouldn't with Yen Sid's creation, a world where forgotten characters could live. But his meddling resulted in the creation of a monster called the Blot, and it consequentially turned the world into a wasteland. Fast forwarding years later, when Mickey became a cartoon star, the Blot pulled him into the wasteland, now a more twisted and dystopian version of itself, where the mouse sees firsthand the severe consequences to his past actions, and knew on the spot that he had to fix the problems that he caused by taking down the Blot with the help of some allies he met along the way. The story is often told through 2D cutscenes with a special art style reminiscent to the works of Mary Blair, one of the well-known artists from Walt's days who defined the look of It's a Small World. As for Oswald's role in this story, he gradually evolved throughout production, where he started as the main villain, but then his evilness got significantly reduced to the jealous long-lost brother of Mickey. As he was the first resident of the wasteland, he and the Mad Doctor from the 1933 cartoon developed the world to be like their interpretation of Disneyland, where he could live the life he wished he had that he claimed Mickey took. But when he finally confronts the mouse that he resented for more than 80 years, the world he helped made was so much in ruin that he has no choice but to team up with Mickey to save his home. That, or secretly take the opportunity to swap places with Mickey so that he can get the fame that he wanted. Inside the wasteland, the residents are inhabited by a variety of Disney characters between the 1920s up to the late 1960s. Basically throughout the time that Walt Disney was alive. These included old cartoon characters like Horace Horsecollar and the Lonesome Ghost, characters from canceled projects like The Gremlins, a scrap movie that was a collaboration between Walt and Roald Dahl, which the Gremlins leader, Gremlin Gus, aids Mickey along his journey, and creating alternate versions of characters like the Phantom Blot from the comics and the Clock Tower from It's a Small World. In a way, Junction Point was narratively creating their own version of Kingdom Hearts. Except where you enter the world of recognizable Disney classics in the Square Enix games, this one is meant to feature characters from a variety of media that everyone forgot about, including Mickey himself.
Ooh! Ooh! No!
But of course, as it is a video game, the key component to playing this is a philosophy that the team followed called playstyle matters. You see, Mickey is given a magical brush that has the power to shoot out two things, either paint, which can repair and restore things, or thinner, which can erase and destroy them. Depending on how much the player used one or the other, their actions affect how the game itself and a bit of how the story would progress, including the kind of power-ups they receive, either turn enemies into helpers or just take them down, who they get to talk to along the way, and even the tone of the music composed by Jim Dooley. This also includes which side quests they could accomplish, like fixing up animatronic versions of Mickey's pals like Goofy, Donald, and Daisy. It would have also affected how Mickey looked, like more paint would make you look more heroic with yellow gloves, or more thinner would make you less saturated and scrappier looking. But that idea didn't make it to the final cut. As for the type of game itself, Spectre and the team decided to make it a platformer, as a big part of it is to explore around the dark steampunk versions of beloved Disney rides, on top of implementing side-scrollers that act as segues between the areas that are based on some of Mickey's and Oswald's more popular cartoons, and a couple of movies like Fantasia and Sleeping Beauty. Originally, the game was supposed to be for the PC, Xbox 360, and the PlayStation 3, but when it came to the other console at the time, the Nintendo Wii, it didn't really seem possible, especially when the console was unique in the way that it sacrificed some graphics power in favor of innovative motion controls. But since this has more of a cartoony art style than something realistic, detailed graphics was never a high priority for the platformer. And since the motion controls seemed to be a good fit for the game where the player can use the remote like a paintbrush, they completely switched plans where the game now became a Wii exclusive. Also, while the characters have a recognizable retro look that pays homage to their beginnings, their designs used to lean more on the epic than the Mickey. At one point, they considered to have a taller and sleeker look for players to take Mickey more seriously as an action hero and more appealing for teens and older audiences. Kind of like going through the same evolution Sonic did with his design when he went from 2D to 3D. However, this is a Mickey Mouse game after all, and it was probably not a good idea to tamper with the look of possibly the world's most famous cartoon character. So staying accurate to the source material was probably important here. For the next few years, Junction Point was slowly bringing the game to life in secrecy, with no one in the public aware of its existence. That is, until the summer of 2009, when Disney made headlines in the most unexpected way. A set of early concept art was released on the internet that presented a much darker side of Disney. A cursed castle standing on top of a tall spire, old cartoon characters on a beach next to a giant jug of thinner, death-like demons with black liquid coming out of them, and mechanical monsters like a country bear scorpion, a giant narwhal carrying Walt Disney World landmarks, and a mecha zombie Goofy. No one really knew what these were for, other than the small piece of info that it was for a video game with the working title that ultimately stayed in the final product, Epic Mickey. After rumors and discussions about what this could be about, Disney finally made the announcement a few months later in October that they were indeed working on a game called Disney Epic Mickey, set to release the year after, that was meant to reboot the image of Mickey Mouse and put Oswald back in the spotlight, now as a cartoon star made by Walt himself. As time kept moving closer to its release date, the hype for the game grew significantly larger, and Disney did put in the effort to prepare for the occasion with press events, merchandising like Wii accessories, a prequel Digicomic miniseries by Marvel, and even preparing a special collector's edition. And after the rare occasion of anticipation for a Disney game, players finally got to enter the wasteland at the end of November of 2010. And the result turned out to be good. Just good. I know you expect an epic pun here, but that wouldn't be accurate. On average, the critics generally enjoyed it with an average rating of around 7 or even 8 out of 10, saying that the parts that are good are actually amazing and maybe some of the best on the Wii, like the story, the graphics and designs, and the tribute to Disney's legacy gives it an unforgettable appeal. However, there's just one thing about it that kept the game away from being a masterpiece. And that's the part where it has to be a video game. The most common complaint about Epic Mickey is that actually playing it is more of a hassle than the Wasteland dealing with all those blotlings. Even if it's built as a solid platformer, the controls can get repetitive with its Super Mario Sunshine-like brush where all you do is either paint or thin stuff, and the camera feels like it's being operated by a drunk from Pirates of the Caribbean.
Don't you worry there, lad. Be sure to stay very still while I keep me eye on you. Whoop! Did you fall down again? Well, at least it ain't my fault this time.
But regardless of how people may feel about the game, there was no denying that it was a major hit. When it came out in North America on November 30th, 2010, the Disney Store's website completely sold out their copies on the same day, and during the first month alone, Epic Mickey managed to sell around 1.3 million copies. For that moment, Disney finally accomplished their mission of turning Mickey into not just a cartoon star, but also a video game icon. But while Disney and the Junction Point team celebrated, Warren couldn't help but feel bothered by the game's criticisms. Yes, he was and still is very proud of what he did, but it did sting that the one thing the video game failed at was being a video game. If he could rework on it to fix those problems, he definitely would. But since the game did manage to make millions, there was a way for Spector to get his second chance. With the sequel. On March of 2012, he officially announced that his team was working on the follow-up to the game called Epic Mickey 2: The Power of Two, emphasizing that it's not just Mickey's game, but he's also sharing the spotlight with his brother, Oswald. In the second game, the story focuses on the return of the Mad Doctor, now with a change of heart, promising to help improve the Wasteland after the events of the predecessor. However, some are a little suspicious of the Doctor and call on Mickey's help to know what he's really up to. So, with the help of Oswald and Gremlin Gus by his side, Mickey goes even deeper in the Wasteland to ruin areas he never entered before to find out the Mad Doctor's secret plans and the mystery of a particular gremlin named Prescott. In order to enhance the storytelling, the team decided to include additional elements that were noticeably missing from the first game. These include voice acting, where they not only brought in the classic Disney gang to voice their characters, but also have some notable actors like Frank Welker as Oswald, Carrie Elways as Gremlin Gus, and Jason Marsden as Ghost Ian. Also, to truly capture the feeling of a Disney classic, they decided to also include a standout component during the cutscenes: musical numbers.
Friends, 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 I stand before you a changed man. I've seen the error of my ways.
You know, I remember when they first revealed this song when mentioning that the game was going to be a musical, and all I could think of was just, really? Are we really doing this? Okay. But most importantly, The biggest goal of the Power of Two was to make the gameplay bigger and a whole lot better. As it does emphasize the Power of Two, the game also features Oswald as an assistant for the player, where they can perform new moves when they work together and have him help solve puzzles. But even better is that a second player can join and play the game where they can control Oswald instead of an AI. As for the biggest problem of the first game, Spectre made a promise that his team would work until the game's release to make sure that the camera would no longer be an issue. In fact, he even stated that over 1,000 changes were done so that the player wouldn't have to feel like they gotta adjust the camera manually. And to really mark how Epic Mickey just got even bigger with the sequel, Disney decided to make it a multi-platform game where it wasn't just for the Wii, but also made it available for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, the newly released Wii U, and later on for the PlayStation Vita and PC, where additional studios help out to work on the other platform versions like Blitz Game Studios and Heavy Iron Studios. But that wasn't all. Disney had much bigger plans for Epic Mickey so that it wouldn't just be a set of platforming games. They wanted it to turn it into a major franchise. At the same time as the Power of Two, the developer Dreamrift was working on a spin-off game for the Nintendo 3DS called Epic Mickey Power of Illusion. In a way, it had less to do with Epic Mickey and acted more like a spiritual successor to Sega's Castle of Illusion games, where Mickey has to save Minnie from Mizrabel, who takes on the form of several Disney villains, and rescue many popular Disney characters in the Wasteland centerpiece, Dark Beauty Castle. Everything was all set for Epic Mickey to make a comeback that's twice as big, with twice the games and twice the gameplay power. Disney was ready to truly show the Power of Two. And it turned out that at the end of November 2012, that power was weak. While nobody called it a disaster, and does have its merits, like still having strong designs and that Disney charm by creating a whole world with its history, the game was a disappointment compared to the original. Sure, the camera was better, but the rest of the gameplay is still as problematic as before. Actually playing it can feel more like a chore, the controls are often frustrating, and there are very few things in this world that are dumber than Oswald's AI. The same can almost be said about Power of Illusions, where the reviews were slightly better and critics love the look and the ideas of the game, but it's just way too short and the gameplay can get quickly repetitive. As for the sales of 2, despite that it was available on more platforms, it only sold a fraction of how the first game performed, where only 529,000 copies were bought on its first month. And immediately on the spot, Disney just lost interest on Epic Mickey. Sadly, only a few months after the release of those 2 games, Disney shut down Junction Point, to which Warren Spector would go on to work at the University of Texas for a few years, and then later open a new gaming studio in 2016 called Other Side Entertainment. Of course, since the franchise ended so abruptly, there were several projects that ultimately went into the wasteland along with it. These include a third Epic Mickey game, which would have been the final part of the trilogy, a spin-off racing game called Epic Disney Racers that would feature all kinds of Disney characters both in and out of Epic Mickey, and Epic Donald, another spin-off starring Donald Duck in a world based on the Carl Barks comics. There was also an original game that Junction Point was making called Project Goliath, a 3D platformer inspired by games like Ratchet & Clank and Banjo-Kazooie. However, that game went down along with the studio. As for Disney's gaming division with Disney Interactive, they would move on a year later to create a toy-based sandbox game, Disney Infinity, which went through the same cycle as Epic Mickey. The first game was a big hit, they released 2 follow-ups, and then 3 years later, they shut everything down. This time also completely closing Disney Interactive, where now they only rely on third-party developers to produce any console or PC games that require their characters to be a part of them. And now, Epic Mickey's legacy is met with an ironic fate. For a franchise that brings players to the forgotten world of Disney, the games themselves are now exactly that. A forgotten piece of Disney history lost in the video game wasteland. But when there are people who do remember Epic Mickey, they mostly seem to remember it quite fondly. Among all the games that the company brought out, Epic Mickey was possibly the best game Disney ever made on their own. While it may not have succeeded in making Mickey a video game icon in the long run, it still made an impact in Disney's history by achieving a few of its own goals. It reintroduced Oswald the Lucky Rabbit into the 21st century, where he is now a prominent member of the Disney family. It proved to the world before the Paul Ruddish cartoons that Mickey Mouse can be much more than just a corporate mascot, and it showed everyone that Disney is not afraid to get weird and freaky, like give some of their well-known kid-friendly icons a dark twist. Even if the franchise was short-lived, to this day, Epic Mickey does have a cult following that highly admires both the amazing concept art done for the games and the game itself. Overall, Epic Mickey was an ambitious attempt to turn Disney's history into an immersive adventure, taking two of Walt's earliest and greatest creations and having them feature in a story about facing consequences to your own actions, letting go of a grudge, and most of all, redemption. It's possibly the only video game that is not just unapologetically Disney, but it also fully celebrates Disney's heritage and reminds people why these characters are timeless and so lovable. It's obviously not the best game out there, but for many Disney fans, it was absolutely epic.
Epic Mickey! Now for the Nintendo Wii console! Buy it or you don't have it!